Hey guys, before I go to bed, I will read one chapter. So one chapter means 30 minutes. So at that time will be 10 o'clock, right? It's perfect timing. Now I will read chapter 6 of Wave Me Goodbye book by Jacqueline Wilson. In chapter 6, we'll surely find her home and who she lived with and who are those people. Let's find out. In the last chapter, it was pretty sad because she can't go with her best friend, and also nobody wants her. But let's find out in chapter 6. Let's get started. Come on now, keep together, said Mr. Bentley. Quick march! Left, right, left, right. We stared at each other. Was he serious? We're not bleeding army, Kevin muttered. I heard that, said Mr. Bentley sharply. Any more swearing, and I'll pick you up by those remarkable ears and give you a good shaking, young man. Kevin mouthed a whole series of bad words the moment his back was turned, but took care not to say them out loud. He did an explanation of marching, and the others copied. Except for the spotty girl, Kathleen. She swayed her hips, tossing her hair, and walking her own way. She looked quite pretty from behind. It was such a shame about her spots. I hoped they wouldn't start sprouting from my own face when I was older. Vera did her best to sway her hips too, but she looked ridiculous. A total waggle bottom. Kevin nudged little Archie, and they stuck their own scrawny buttons out and giggled them around, snorting with laughter at their silly antics. They even raised a smile from Renee. Mrs. Henshaw sighed disapprovingly and pointed warningly at Mr. Bentley at the front, but it was clear that she was on our side. She carried Renee's suitcase because she was so little, but I was left struggling with mine. It pulled on my arms terribly and made my palms of my hands sore. I was sure I was getting blisters. I couldn't march. I could barely walk. I thought of the violent way Jessica had helped me with it, doing much more than her fair share. She would be at the White House by now. Was she missing me the way I was missing her? Or was she already chatting to all of the other girls, doing her best to find a new friend? Not ghastly, goofy, or munchin, but one of the quieter ones, maybe when they unpacked their compared books and promised to swap. Maybe this other girl liked ballet shoes too, and they were having a wonderful discussion about their favorite foster sister, Pauline, or Petrova, or Posy. I tried to distract myself by imagining the three fossils struggling along beside me, evacuated too. Pauline would complain that Nana had sent her in her velvet audition frock, and now it was so tight under her arms she was scared the seams might tear. Petrova would lighter by the little village garage we were passing in real life and hoped to make friends with one of the mechanics there. Posy would be fussing about her dancing, wondering who would teach her ballet now and whether they could possibly be good enough. I became a little too distracted by my imaginary book friends and didn't look where I was going. One of the paving stones was loose. I tripped over the raised edge and was so lopsided with my heavy suitcase that I couldn't recover my footing. I fell flat on my face. Oopsie-daisy, said Mrs. Henshaw. I lay there stunned, unable to move. She dropped down dead, Archie rasped. Dear Lord, now what? Who was horsing around? Mr. Bentley demanded. This little girl's simply fallen over. I'm sure she's all right, said Mrs. Henshaw, but she sounded scared. I heard a rustle as she squatted down beside me. Surely is it? Are you all right, dear? She asked, giving me a tentative shake. I didn't want to open my eyes because I felt so foolish. I wanted to stay lying there, throbbing, until they eventually got fed up and wandered off, as the fossil sisters seemed to have done. Surely, Sally, whatever name yours is. Come on, sit up, Mr. Bentley commanded. I need to see if you really hurt yourself. I'm all right, I mumbled, horrified by all the fuss. I sat up to prove it. I was heartbroken to see that I scuffed the toes of my beautiful red patent shoes. I barely noticed that I would scrub my knees too, and both were bleeding. Oh dear, said Mrs. Henshaw, wincing, dabbing at them with her lace hanky. Her face was very close to mine. I could even see the little smudge of dark red lipstick on her front tooth. Her fancy hat was now a little knee width, at an unsuitably jaunted angle. I felt uncomfortable being so near her and tried to wiggle away. That's it. Check all your limbs, though I'm pretty certain you haven't broken anything. What makes you fall over? Did you suddenly feel dizzy or did you trip over something? She asked. No, I just fell, I mumbled, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing at my case. Mrs. Henshaw took hold of my suitcase handle and tried to lift it. Oh my goodness! Well, it's perfectly obvious why you fell over, Shirley. This is much too heavy for a little girl. Doesn't your mother get the correct list? Mr. Bentley demanded, opening my case without so much as by your leave. The silly woman packed everything but the kitchen sink. And what on earth are these books? I felt as if I would scream if anyone questioned me about them. I saw all my favorite fictional friends, human and animal, wincing at his voice. I'll take them with me. We'll start a little library for everyone, said Mr. Bentley. Oh, I said, oh no, you mustn't do that. I beg your pardon? He said, don't use that tone with me, young lady. I think it's just the shock, said Mrs. Henshaw quickly, patting my back. Mr. Bentley snorted and started gathering up my books, looking at them rather disapprovingly. I can't see any boys wanted to borrow these, but I suppose the girls will like some of the stories, he murmured. I couldn't bear the sight of his big hands, holding them. Hair grew right down to his knuckles, as if he were a gorilla inside a big gray suit. I thought of all those other hands grasping my books, opening them clumsily, breaking the spines, turning down the corners of the pages. I thought of Marilyn Henderson scribbling all over my favorite drawings of Pauline, Petrova, and Posy, and printing, "This is stupid rubbish" in the margins. I'm very sorry, Mr. Bentley. Please don't be cross, but I simply have to keep these books myself, I said. He had all my precious books gathered in his arms now. He shook his head at me. Well, you're very selfish little girls, aren't you? He said. It will do you good to learn how to share. You don't understand, sir, I said desperately. They're not my books. They're my mom's. They were all her favorites when she was a girl. I knew some of them hadn't even been published when Mom was little, but I hope Mr. Bentley wouldn't know that. Well, when you go home again, I dare say you can return them all to her. I'm sure she'll just like to share her childhood favorites with the rest of the school, said Mr. Bentley pointedly. He must be mad to think Mom would want to lend so much as a torn comic to any of the children at Paradise Road Juniors. I thought hard, my brain whirling at the top speed like a little top. I know, but Mom's not here. She died. We've only just had the funeral. I felt so wicked saying it, as if I were tempting fate. Perhaps Mom would really die now. I felt the tears welling in my eyes at the thought. Oh, you poor little pet, said Mrs. Henshaw, putting her arm around me. And Dad's away in the army on this special secret mission to do with the upcoming war. And I have to go and live with my auntie when I'm back. And these books are the only things of my mom's she's letting me keep. And I need them so. I wept, almost believing it. There now, said Mrs. Henshaw, pressing me to her large treated bosom. Of course you can keep all your mom's precious books. Don't worry. I'll mention it when we find your billet, and make sure you can have them all by yourself, dear. Isn't that right, Mr. Bentley? Mr. Bentley didn't look as if he agreed at all, but he didn't argue any further. He put them all back in my suitcase, tossing them as if they were a coatis, and when he saw Mrs. Henshaw looking at him, he gave the top of my head a dog pat. Now, he said. Your mom died? Vera asked, peering at me through her thick glasses. She clearly wasn't very quick on the uptake. I nodded solemnly. I think my mom's died, Archie said matter-of-factly. I'm sure that's not true, said Mrs. Henshaw said. But you don't know, said Kathleen. When the war started and all the bombs come, all our moms would get blown up. My mom, said Vera, looking as if she were going to start crying too. Mr. Bentley flashed me a look and Dad said, Now, so you've started. Come along, children. Let's stop all this morbid nonsense. You're gonna need a bandage, surely, said Mrs. Henshaw. Anyone got another spare hanky? Archie didn't have one, nor did Vera or Renee. Kathleen might have, but she was keeping it to herself. Kevin offered one, but it was gray and in a disgusting state. Mrs. Henshaw reeled back at the sight of it and shook her head. Then she looked up at Mr. Bentley. Aha! I can see a lovely clean white hanky peeping out of your top pocket. Mr. Bentley, she said. He sighed and handed it over. Mr. Henshaw bound it tightly around the wearer's knee. There now, that should stop the flow. Now, let's see if you can walk on those poorly legs. She helped me up and I walked gingerly. There, right as rain, said Mr. Bentley. Come along then, troops. It'll be getting dark soon. This good lady needs to find you all decent roof over your heads. I struggled to lift my suitcase. Mrs. Henshaw looked pointedly at Mr. Bentley. We don't want her tripping all over again, she said. He sighed and seized the handle from me. Good Lord above, he murmured, but he carried it for me. And you lad, Kevin, is it? Take Shirley's arm, said Mrs. Henshaw. I don't know which of us looked more appalled, Kevin or me. I'm not taking her arm, miss. She's not my sweetheart or some sister or nothing, said Kevin. I simply need you to help her along, you fair head. I'm not suggesting you become betrothed, said Mrs. Henshaw, laughing heartily. I don't need any help, I insisted, but she took hold of my arm and forced my hand to grip Kevin's bony elbow. There now, she said. So we straggled on around the village. I had to stay hooked onto Kevin, smelling his musty, unwashed clothes. We couldn't walk properly together, but we were such different sizes. He took great strides, while I was reduced to hobbling. I felt the blood soaking through Mr. Bentley's handkerchief. It started trickling down into my socks. If it got stained red, it would match my patent shoes. My toes were so sore and cramped. Perhaps they were bleeding too. I wondered how long it would be before every drop of blood drained out of and I collapsed like an empty paper bag. Mrs. Henshaw knocked on various doors. Her message was the same at each one. Hello there. So sorry to trouble you. I'm Mrs. Henshaw from the hall chairman of the Women's Institute. I'm sure you've seen me around the village. I've been appointed chief billeting officer according to my list. You haven't yet volunteered to be a foster parent. I'm sure you're like to take one or two of the children. 2 girls, 2 boys, 1 of each. She edged forward as she spoke, getting a foot in the door in an intimidating fashion, but it didn't work. The villagers shook their heads and muttered excuses. One simply slammed their door in her face. We don't want any London kiddies, thanks very much. And you can play until you're blues in the face, but we don't have to. Not if we don't want, they retorted. There's no law says we got to. I wish there was a law, Mrs. Henshaw muttered, really upset of some of these metal riggers. Could we not try the next villages? Mr. Bentley suggested. That's a good 5 miles away. It's much too far for the children to walk, and it would be a nightmare trying to find transportation. I have a car, but my husband is using it on my business, she said. No, we must keep pressing on. Nil does a rum. Nil indeed, said Mr. Bentley uncertainly. But it seemed a hopeless task. Mrs. Henshaw kept consulting her list and trying all the homes that didn't yet have their 2 allocated evacuees. But people shook their heads determinedly, and one fierce couple even threatened to set the dogs on us if we didn't leave immediately. They were 2 barking assistants straining at their leashes, and even Mr. Bentley looked frightened and backed away rapidly. Then at last, one woman softened when she opened the door of her tiny cottage and saw us all standing on her garden path. I've got 5 kitties of my own, 3 boys and 2 girls in one room. Still, I dare say I might squeeze in just one more. I'll take a small girl if you've got one, she said cheerily. I hunched up, trying to look extremely small, but it didn't work. Renee was much smaller than Kathleen or Vera or me. She got taken in, and the rest of us were left. Mrs. Henshaw tried its houses at the end of the village. She crossed her fingers as she marched up by the overgrown path of the very last house, a large square once like a child's drawing. She knocked loudly on the door and waited. Then she knocked again and still waited. It's obvious nobody's in, said Mr. Bentley, looking at his watch. I'll try once more, said Mrs. Henshaw, doing so. It might take them a little time, and I suspect they are hard of hearing. As she spoke, a very elderly lady in a lavender frock opened the door, and we glimpsed another similar lady standing a few paces behind her. Ah, Mrs. Robinson. And Miss Robinson, hello there. So sorry to trouble you. I'm Mrs. Henshaw from... Oh, we know who you are, dear, said the Miss Robinson. At the door, she peered at us curiously. Oh my, are these the poor little children from London? We drove uneasily. Stand up straight, Mr. Bentley hissed. The first Miss Robinson looked at him. Are you their father? She asked. He looked appalled. Oh no, madam, I'm their headmaster, he said. I am trying to find a billet for the last of my pupils. We wondered if you and your sister would take care of 2 of them, Mrs. Henshaw asked. Miss Robinson blinked in surprise. Oh, goodness me! We couldn't possibly. We're far too old to look after little children. We can't barely much to look after ourselves nowadays. Besides, we're maiden ladies. We have no experience. Perhaps the 2 boys might be help to you, fetching and carrying and doing the gardening, Mrs. Henshaw suggested. Oh, definitely not. We couldn't cope with noisy boys, said Miss Robinson. I'm sorry, Mrs. Henshaw, but it simply wouldn't do. She made to close the door, but her sister came forward and stood shoulder to shoulder with her. Perhaps one of the girls' sister, she said timidly. The first Robinson looked astonished. I'm sure a girl wouldn't be too noisy. The second sister said, Look at them, poor little mites. They look exhausted. I think we could take a girl, perhaps 2 at a pinch. Well, sister, if you really think so, said the first Miss Robinson. I suppose we could train them up a little. Kathleen, Vera, and I looked at them hopefully. I didn't particularly want to go and live with 2 ancient old ladies, especially as it seemed likely they want to turn us into housemaids, but neither did I want to spend the rest of the night traipsing to the next village, and then the next and the next. I knew my hair looked too plain without its ribbon, and I had 2 bloody knees and scraped shoes, but Kathleen had a bad complexion and a sulky expression, but Vera's broken glasses didn't help her looks. But the second sister shuffled towards Vera, smiling at her. What about this excellent one? She said. Excellent, said Mrs. Henshaw, and I'm sure that you want to take her friend to us company. You like that? Wouldn't you, Vera? Oh, yes, said Vera huskily, and held out her hand to Kathleen. She's my friend. My heart sank. Mrs. Henshaw put her arm round my shoulders. Perhaps all 3 girls? She tried. We can only make 2 at the most, the first Miss Robinson said decidedly, and that's going to be a pinch. There will be an allowance, though the paperwork is going to be a massive task. said Mrs. Henshaw, and doubtless it will all have to be organized by yours truly. Still, we must all do our duty. Thank you very much, ladies. Bye-bye, Vera and Kathleen. We left them standing uncertainly on the doorstep. So I was the last girl. I prickled with humiliation. So what about us, miss? Archie said, tugging at Mrs. Henshaw's tweeded skirt. Why ain't we got nowhere to stay? Because nobody wants us, you daft little beggar, said Kevin, shrugging. I think we might sound as if he couldn't care less, but his voice wobbled. Nonsense, said Mrs. Henshaw. Two fine lads and a lovely little girl. Of course, people will want you. We just have to find the right people. Now, let's put my thinking cap on. She looked back down the main village street. Then she looked up the hill. I saw the long white gleam of Lady Amershon's manor house. I know, I said. I know where we can go. Up there, with Street's Agatha's. I know for a fact that they'll have a spare bedroom because Jessica said several of the girls didn't turn up at the station. I'm not going with no girls, said Kevin. Me neither, agreed Archie. Well, not them posh ones. I could go, though, I said. Jessica's my best friend, and I know the others, too. And Sister Josephine. Oh, please, Mrs. Henshaw, can't I go and live at Later's Asherman's? No, dear, you can't go there. You're not bona fide people, she said, barely listening. She turned her back on me and looked up another direction. Bona fide, I said. It's Latin, dear, she murmured, staring up at the other hill. I still didn't have a clue what bona fide meant. I knew Latin was an old language that was only a attempt in posh schools. If you knew Latin, you were very clever. I come top my class, Mrs. Henshaw, I said quickly, to show her I might be able to learn it too, and I was top of my old school. Mr. Bentley stared at me. Now, no one likes to show off, he said sharply. I had a feeling I didn't know Latin either. Mrs. Henshaw was listening to us. I think I know where you can go, she said, tossing her head so that her feather waved in the air. Just her, miss, or us too? Archie asked. I don't see why you can all stay there. I'm sure you could have a room each, said Mrs. Henshaw. Do you see that big house up there? It's called a red house. A red house on one hill, a white house on the other. It sounds like a scene in Alice. I reckon there's at least 6 bedrooms, but only one lady lives there. Well, 2 ladies actually, she said. Old ladies like the Mrs. Robinson? Asked Kevin. No, the house is owned by Mrs. Waverley, a lady about my age, said Mrs. Henshaw. We thought Mrs. Henshaw must be very old, so that wasn't reassuring. Mr. Bentley didn't look happy either. For goodness sake, do we really have to go all the way to the hill? It'll be getting dark soon. Why don't we try there first? He demanded. I suppose you have a point, Mr. Bentley, Mrs. Waverley. Entirely slipped my mind. She's rather a recluse. She doesn't come down to the village very often. A recluse? He asked. Do you mean she's not quite the ticket? Oh no, she's entirely compos mentis, said Mrs. Henshaw, spouting her precious Latin again, and leaving us all in the dark. She smiled at Kevin and Archie and me. Come along then, chaps and chapness. Best foot forward. She bonkers, Kevin muttered to me. I don't know what she's on about half the time. I didn't either, but I was too tired and sort of care. Archie seemed past it too. He clung to Mrs. Henshaw, sniffing continuously, and Mr. Bentley was making heavy work of carrying my suitcase, putting it down every 10th step, and groaning. Oh, dear Mr. Bentley, said Mrs. Henshaw, perhaps I'll better take a turn with that grudge suitcase. I had a serious problem with my back, he said huffily. But I'll manage. I'll have to. It's a shame some people were more considerate. He looked balefully in my direction. Why don't you stay down in the village? Go to your digs at the hostel. I'll sort the children out, Mrs. Henshaw offered. Certainly not. I'm the headmaster and all Paradise Road pupils are my responsibility, said Mr. Bentley. Besides, I can't have a lady unsorted. Mrs. Henshaw threw a little and gave a girlish giggle. So we labored on, dragging back through the village. Archie had distant moving and panicked. Mrs. Henshaw ended carrying him and his cardboard case of tattered. We followed, finding ourselves in a dark red room with the entire wall covered in bookshelves. Yes, we were going to find Mrs. Warverley and finally her maid let us in. In the dim light of the single rose-colored oil lamp, I peered at all the amazing books. The lamp stood on a table beside a chaise lounge. On it lay a lady, propped up with embroidered cushion. She was wearing a long blue velvet robe, perhaps a dressing gown. "Hello, Madeline," said Mrs. Henshaw, still cradling Archie in her arms. "I haven't seen you for a long time. How are you? You don't know who I am, aren't you?" "Of course I know who you are, Margaret," said Mrs. Waverley, sounded dazed. "What are you doing here?" She looked at Chubby. "I didn't let her in," said Chubby. "She barged in without so much as by your leave, bringing half a dozen little brats with her, and the stray spoke into the bargain. The cheek of it! I'm Mr. Bentley, the children's headmaster. And there are only 3 children, Madeline, the last 3 of our little evacuees from London. I've managed to find bullets from all the others, and I'm very much hoping you will welcome these 3 into your lovely home," said Mr. Bentley. Said Mrs. Henshaw. "Then you can think again," said Chubby. "We can't possibly get all those brats." "There won't be any trouble. They'll be at school most of the time," said Mrs. Henshaw. "You'll to send them this coming Monday." "Please, I should Coco," said Chubby. "We never put our name down on that stupid form you sent around. It said it was voluntary. Well, we're not volunteering. We can't cope with kiddies here." "Circumstances have changed now that we're not break of war," said Mrs. Henshaw. "It's compulsory now. The law has changed. Every householder with spare rooms is compelled to take evacuated children under the roof. I'm certain you have several spare rooms." I stared at her. She was telling a lie. "We might have spare rooms, but they're not furnished," said Mrs. Waverley. "Oh, don't give me that, Madeline. Your house is furnished." Mrs. Henshaw gestured around the room with her spare hand. Archie stopped blowing against her chest and peered about sleepily. He looked like a strange little alien with his bald head and huge eyes. He blinked, a tear running down his cheek. Chubby's face softened as she stared at him. "Let's take the baby," she said to Mrs. Waverley. "He didn't look too much trouble. I dare say I'll cope." "Very well," said Mrs. Waverley. "There you are, Margaret. Mission accomplished." "Couldn't you possibly take this little girl too?" said Mr. Bentley. "I can't carry her suitcase another step. It weighs a ton." "It's full of books, Madeline," said Mrs. Henshaw. "She couldn't bear to leave them behind." Mrs. Waverley peered at me. "Do you like reading, child?" "It's my best thing ever." "Mrs. Waverley," I said. She seemed so surprised, maybe even a little amused. "It's my best thing ever, too." She looked at Chubby. "Perhaps we ought to take this little girl, too." Chubby shrugged. "Well, you have to amuse her, then. I'll have my hands full with the baby." "That's excellent." "And you'll take the boy as well?" "I like books and all," said Kevin quickly. "You want to see the shelves and grab one of the leather volumes. See, I can read." Mr. Waverley winced. "Please put that book back on the shelves," she said. She turned to Miss Henshaw. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm sure it's not compulsory to take 3 evacuees." "But there isn't anywhere else." I looked at Kevin. His hands were trembling as he slotted the book back on the shelf. He started nibbling a nail again. His face curled up, and I knew he was trying not to cry. I couldn't bear it. I went to Miss Waverley and knelt beside her, lying down with her thumb on my sore knees. It hurt so much it was easy to start crying myself. "Please let Kevin stay too," I sobbed. Mr. Waverley sighed. "Oh, very well," she murmured. "Yes, so finally they have a place to stay. Let's be next time for chapter 7. Bye guys. I better go to sleep now. It's exactly 30 minutes. Bye.